Dedicated transports are often not the centerpiece that we build our armies around, but whilst they might not be the flashiest models, their use in game is incredibly important. Hello and welcome to Epic Flail 40k Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about dedicated transports. Specifically, some tips and tricks to get the most out of them in our games of 40k. Not all factions can make use of transports, so maybe this is something you're just a bit unfamiliar with in-game, and if that's the case for you, by the end of this video, you'll have some useful tips for how to approach your opponent's dedicated transports in your next game. Let's get started. I'm going to whiz through the basics of dedicated transports. If this is something that you're familiar with at this point, then by all means skip ahead. But if you want a refresher or you think there's something you might pick up, please do listen on. It's important to remember that we need to start the game with units inside a dedicated transport, or it counts as destroyed. And all this really does is prevent you from taking empty transports and making a weird list, or just trying to spam extra transports because you just want lots of little units and not really care about what fills them up. All dedicated transports will have a transport capacity that will be indicated by a number on their datasheet. And if there are any other restrictions as to the amount of models that can go inside, that will be written onto the datasheet as well. As I mentioned, models have to start the game inside the transport, but that doesn't stop you from then getting models out later in the game. In order to disembark from a transport, if a unit from your army starts the movement phase inside the transport model, it can get out basically, but whenever it does so, it has to end wholly within 3 inches of that transport model, not within engagement range of any other models. And if you can't set up every model, then you can't set up that unit. Units that get out from a transport that hasn't yet moved or fallen back can act normally. They can basically make a normal move, they can charge, they can shoot, advance, etc. And by virtue of the fact it's gotten out of the transport, it's not considered to have remained stationary, which makes sense. It's just got out of the transport. This matters for things like heavy weapons. You won't get the +1 to hit if you firing heavy weapons getting out of a transport. If the transport moved beforehand, then any units inside count as having made a normal move themselves, and they can't move any more in that phase, so they also can't declare a charge. But they can otherwise act normally, like shoot. And also if a transport advanced or fell back, the unit inside can't get out of it. Firing deck allows you to shoot if you have weapons. Whatever the number next to the firing deck rule allows the vehicle to fire that many shots, or that many weapons, I should say, as if it was equipped with those weapons. Making sure you fully understand the firing deck and all the rules that go with that, because with the firing deck, it's the transport that counts as shooting those guns, not the models inside. The firing deck rule allows the vehicle to count as being equipped with those weapons in a sense. Where this gets interesting is if the vehicle in question has rules that affect its shooting attacks. As I mentioned in my video the other week, the Chimera gets a really good benefit of this because it has good keywords to benefit from the amendments made to the army rule. And for any unit that didn't start the game inside a transport, you can embark inside a transport if you make a normal advance or a fallback move, and every model in the unit ends within 3 of a friendly transport model. Not wholly within, but just within 3, they can embark inside it. You can't get out of one transport and then hop into another transport in the same turn. But what you can do is get inside a transport, and then that transport can then move, which is really useful because the transport has yet to activate. You can move quite far up the board with the help of a transport. If you've moved 6 inches in advance, say you roll a 3, so you move 9 inches up the board, you end every model within 3 of a transport, and that transport hasn't yet moved, and that transport's got a movement of 12. That's a fairly common movement value, and then it moves 12 inches across the board. That unit has effectively managed to travel 12 plus 9 inches, so you can get some pretty big distances covered across the table with the help of transports. Very useful for that. If the transport gets destroyed, you roll dice for every model in the unit, and every one that you roll is a mortal wound suffered by the unit. You choose who, and then the unit becomes battle shocked, which can be quite annoying if you had defensive stratagems that you were hoping to use. You can't then use them, so that's something to think about if you're banking on throwing a unit out there as bait, but then making it difficult to kill. Once it's got blown out the transport, that won't work with stratagems. Something that we do have to be careful with transports that doesn't always come up, because normally if a transport moves, you can't then disembark and then charge once you've disembarked, as I mentioned earlier. But let's say you had something like a Land Raider, I think has that special rule that lets you charge after you disembark from a transport. If in your turn the transport gets blown up because it's been overwatched, for example, the unit inside disembarks, becomes battle shock, it can't move any further, it counts as having made a normal move essentially, and then not only that, it can't then charge. So that's something to bear in mind if you're barreling towards a unit hoping to charge it, but there might be an overwatch that's threatening the transport you're in. Maybe you only got 1 or 2 wounds left on that model. If it gets overwatched, you won't be able to charge. Definitely something to be mindful of when we're hurtling our close combat units around the board. That is something that will ruin your day. And then you've got the emergency disembarkation rule. Models get out the transport when it blows up. depending on how many might have died to the mortal wounds, they get out within 3, happy days. But if they can't do that, it's an emergency disembarkation. So what happens here is that it sets up within 6 of the transfer rather than hold it within 3, and again not within engagement range of any enemy models. But when you're rolling for the disembark, you suffer a mortal wound for each roll of a 1 to 3 instead of a roll of 1, so it increases the risk that you'll be destroyed. And if at that point you still have models that can't be set up, then on a model by model basis you destroy them until you're left with the most amount that you can get out in the space that you've got. It's worth noting as well that with the rule of 3 in match play, you can normally only take 3 of a certain unit type, but with dedicated transports you can take up to 6, which gives you the ability to field lots and lots more, which is great. And before I get into some of the tips around how to use dedicated transports, don't forget to check out Epic Flail HQ. Not only do I do regular members content there, but we've also recently streamed some UKTC events, and there have been some fantastic games covered, so you should definitely have a look and check that out. You can find the link to this in the video description below. And if you're considering buying miniatures, then while you're in that video description, consider paying a visit to the affiliate links and making your purchase there, as it goes a long way to support the channel, and it's greatly appreciated. So there are the basics of dedicated transports, but why bother? Well, one of the most important things for dedicated transports, in my view, is flexibility. You have choices in how you can deploy your troops, and this can allow you to create mobile and resilient forces. For example, take Genestealer Colts. They might be doing particularly badly at the moment, but say you have a Goliath truck and you have a unit of 5 Acolytes, a unit of 10 Neophytes, and a unit of 5 Aberrants, and a unit of 5 Genestealers. You could put a unit of Genestealers and a unit of Aberrants in the truck and use that to throw 2 aggressive combat units up front. One that's got the ability to advance and charge, another one that's a lot more durable and hard hitting for elite targets, but 2 units in there. Or you could say, I'll put a unit of Acolytes in there with a unit of Aberrants and mix it up a little bit. Have a unit that can fire flamers, but also a nasty combat threat. Or you can say, I'll just put my basic Neophytes in there and throw them up the board quickly and get sticky objectives somewhere, whilst the other units go off and do things elsewhere. You've got choices and flexibility that you can then swap out depending on the mission and depending on what your opponent's bringing. You just have to have something inside the tank. It doesn't have to be the same thing every game, and if you build that into your list, that gives you some really good flexibility. So that's one of my favourite things about dedicated transport right off the bat. There's no set way to use them. Playing Orcs, I've put Grots inside trucks, I've put Scouting Grots inside trucks, I put Knobs in trucks, Flash Gits, done the old SWAT team thing, I've just filled up with Mega Knobs, just a whole variety of different things, and each one has its own benefits and uses, which is really cool. One thing I particularly like to do is have a mirroring approach when I'm setting up with dedicated transports in particular. So I'll have, maybe again using Orcs as an example, I'll put my commandos down in the middle of the table infiltrating forward. I'll have Gretchen at the backfield objective, my first 2 deployment drops, not really giving an awful lot away. And then my next drop will be maybe a unit of Knobs in a truck on the right flank, and then a unit of Knobs in a truck on the left flank. And I've put 4 units down, and I haven't really given any information to my opponent about where I'm going to deploy and how I'm going to set up. All they know is, yes, he's got something covering his backfield, Grots to screen, he's got the infiltrators in the midboard to either cover an objective or prevent scouts, as that's what infiltrators are for, and then just a transport on one flank, transport on another flank, with that higher movement offered by the transport. If then my opponent decides they're going to overload one flank entirely, it either gives me a flank and I've got that truck sat there happy on the objective on the empty side, or the ability to quickly pivot and drive away from or to wherever I need it to be, away from any sort of threat or towards any objectives I might need to get. Beyond that, the other useful thing with transports is they protect the stuff inside. So if you have a unit that you're wanting to protect from enemy fire, maybe it's a unit that you just want to get on an objective, it's got a high OC value, it might not even be that important beyond holding objectives for you. If you push that forward into no man's land where it's going to get shot, it's a layer of defense before the unit inside can get destroyed. So the enemy has to deal with a tank and then a unit inside. So it's really good defensively, both in terms of the physical units, but also defending your board position and your points and your scoring in game. Transports are fantastic for that. They could be particularly useful with early control of the battlefield. As I mentioned, a truck on each flank, it puts us in a strong position to score key objectives or establish a strong defensive or offensive position, whether we're trying to just push up to stage for a following turn or just defend against opponents pushing forward, and then we leap out and charge onto the objectives. It helps us to influence and exert pressure further up the board than if we don't use the transports. Now, I appreciate I've talked at length about dedicated transports here, and as I mentioned, not all factions have access to them. So if you play one of these factions like Demons and you're feeling a bit left out, then don't worry, I've got you covered in this video I've done with Franco, the True Demon Lord. where we talk all things demons. In the meantime, that's all from me for now. Thanks very much for watching, keep rolling those dice, and stay tuned for more.